Hi, my name is Abraham, and today we're going to talk about the Synoptic Gospels. What are the Synoptic Gospels? Well, if you open your New Testament, you'll find there are 4 Gospels at the very beginning. 3 of them have very similar perspectives, and these are called the Synoptic Gospels, and these include Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is not included as a Synoptic Gospel. The word synoptic means presenting or taking the same or common view, and the word gospel means good news, coming from the Greek euangelion. Let's do an overview of these 3 books. First, we'll start with Mark. Mark is the shortest of these 3 books. It is you can tell by the way it's written that it's very fast-paced. So if you read it, you'll notice that he uses the word immediately quite often. So this is a very short and quick, action-oriented book, possibly the first one written of these 3. It emphasizes the humanity of Christ, so it portrays Jesus as a person, a human, and it also highlights many of his miraculous works. The Gospel of Matthew is written specifically to a Jewish audience. We know this because it mentions many festivals, customs, holidays, and Jewish prophecies of the coming Messiah that many Jews would recognize. So it's definitely geared towards a Jewish audience. It also has interesting things like the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, and it highlights the teachings of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke is very unique because it's written geared towards a Gentile audience, and it's a very detailed account written by a physician. Luke wrote this to someone named Theophilus, and this is actually 2 parts. One first of the 2 parts of Luke's work. The first one is the book of Luke, and then you have the book of Acts, which talks about the early church's history. It has a unique collection of parables, like the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. So these 3 Gospels are definitely related to each other in some way. This is called a triple tradition, meaning you can find content in Mark that you can also find in Luke, and you can find that same content in Matthew, sometimes using the same phrases, same ordering, same wording. And so they definitely were borrowing from each other or from a certain source. And this is what's called the synoptic problem, because we don't know exactly the nature of how these separate books are related to each other. So the synoptic problem tries to understand how these books came about and how they're related to each other. They're all written in Koine Greek, and they're all definitely interdependent on each other. But most scholars say that Mark was definitely written first. This wasn't always the view of people or the church. For example, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Augustine, they all said that Matthew was actually written first. But based on modern day analysis, it seems like Mark was definitely written first. But most scholars also recognize that there was a separate source that Luke and Matthew were borrowing from that Mark didn't. And this is called the double tradition, and also called the 2-source hypothesis, meaning that Luke and Matthew must have been borrowing from Mark, but also borrowing from another source that we don't know about, which is called the Q source. There's also evidence that there was an oral tradition that later on got coagulated and written down into these traditions, into these books. And these were also written within the living memory of Jesus. This is because the destruction of the temple in 70 AD proves, because this content isn't found in these books or actually even commented on. Let's talk about the genre of these books. These books don't actually fall into the category of legend or religious text. They're kind of a mixture of these things. They actually perfectly fit into the Greco-Roman ancient biography genre, and this is true and very different from our modern day biographies in that the details and specifics aren't very clear or prioritized. The chronology is very flexible, meaning Luke will say something happened first, and then Mark will say, no, it happened a different time. There's no consensus on the chronology. There's a focus on the teaching and emphasis on the works of Jesus and who he is. There's also, they do reference sources, but it's definitely different than what we would do with modern day biographies. For example, they use oral traditions and other written sources. There's also a narrative, meaning the writer is trying to give you a specific perspective. And as we went over each of the Gospels, they're written with a different perspective in mind, and they provide a different interpretation of what Jesus was trying to convey in his teachings. Why is this important? Well, we can look at the Gospels not as legends, but actually as historical documents, and at the same time, we can look at them as theological documents. They fit both of those criteria at the same time. They read like biographies, they read like ancient biographies, and they were written within the living memory of Jesus. But at the same time, they interpret what Jesus taught, and they talk about what he taught and give you a perspective on what he was actually saying. And they actually try to preach or convince you of that fact. So these aren't actually legends because they were written within living memory, and it's important for Christians to understand this. And this is a quick overview of the Synoptic Gospels and why they're important to us.